People hear Iran war and think politics. I hear a live demo of modern war tech. Cheap drones, missile salvos, cyber warnings, damaged energy systems, threatened ports, cloud infrastructure catching strays. That is not a side plot. That is the plot. Because the real story here is not just who fired what at whom. It's what the war is revealing about engineering, cost, and fragility. For decades, rich countries built a certain fantasy about conflict, that if you spent enough money, bought enough exquisite systems, and wrapped them in enough acronyms, you could stay comfortably ahead of cheap threats. Now reality is kicking that fantasy in the teeth. The future of war may be brutally simple: cheap offense, expensive defense, and infrastructure as the real battlefield. And that should make everyone sit up a little straighter, because infrastructure is not some abstract military word. Infrastructure is fuel, shipping, power, ports, data centers, telecom, the ugly plumbing that keeps daily life from turning into a scavenger hunt. So this episode is not a war recap. It's a field guide. What happens when modern conflict stops being mostly about cinematic superweapons and starts becoming a systems endurance contest? What happens when the attacker doesn't need a miracle, just enough cheap, numerous, annoying things to make your defense budget sweat? And what happens when the battlefield doesn't end at the front line? Because once the same conflict touches missiles, ports, LNG, cyber, and cloud infrastructure, you are no longer looking at war over there. You are looking at a stress test for civilization with regional accents. Chapter 1: Cheap Offense, Expensive Defense. Start with the hidden math. Cheap offense, expensive defense. That is the sentence quietly eating the modern military budget. AP reports this war is testing America's ability to combat swarms of cheap attack drones, the kind of systems that became a staple of the battlefield after Ukraine made the lesson impossible to ignore. And Reuters goes even further with the atmosphere of it all. Cheap drones are reshaping the war in the sky. That matters because cheap threats do not need to be elegant. They just need to be numerous enough, persistent enough, and ugly enough to force the defender into a miserable exchange. You build a threat for a fraction of the price. The other side burns far more expensive interceptors, sensors, readiness, and attention stopping it. That is the real tax. And then, missiles show up and make the timing problem worse. Reuters reports Iranian cluster missiles are creating an extra challenge for air defenses because they have to be intercepted before they split and scatter bomblets. That means the job is not just hit the missile, it is hit it early enough, high enough, and reliably enough that the problem doesn't become 20 smaller problems. That is a systems problem. Detection, classification, decision speed, interceptor availability, altitude, timing, inventory. And once you start stacking drones and missiles together, the defense game becomes less about one incoming object and more about whether your whole air defense stack can keep functioning under saturation. That's the shift. Modern defense is increasingly not, can you stop a threat? It's, can you keep stopping lots of threats without exhausting yourself first? That is a much nastier question. Because if the answer is no, then the attacker doesn't need air superiority in the old Hollywood sense. They just need to keep making your defensive architecture expensive, tired, and error-prone, which frankly is a very rude but very effective strategy. Chapter 2: The sky is getting crowded. Now zoom out from the sky to the map. Because the sky is only half the story, Reuters reports the war has already left a deep, costly scar on Middle East energy. And another Reuters analysis says shipping flow in and out of the Gulf remains almost entirely suspended after attacks on tankers, with drones, missiles, and mines blocking transit through the Hormuz choke point. That should ring every systems alarm bell you have. Because once energy hubs, LNG facilities, ports, and shipping lanes move into the target set, war stops being just a battlefield problem. It becomes a civilization plumbing problem. This is where people get the story wrong. They imagine infrastructure warfare as some dramatic future concept. No, infrastructure is already in the room. Reuters reports strikes on South Pars and threats against Gulf energy installations. Reuters also reports that ships near Qatar and the UAE were struck by what were most likely Iranian drones or missiles, and that almost 20 vessels in the Gulf had been victims of confirmed attacks or suspicious incidents since February 28th. That is not theoretical. That is a reminder that global systems are held together by choke points and habits. Break the habit, threaten the choke point, and suddenly, prices, routes, and political decisions all start moving. And once shipping slows, the consequences spread outward. Fuel prices, insurance costs, delivery times, strategic stockpiles, military deployments, diplomatic panic. The whole machine starts humming in a much uglier key. This is why I keep saying the battlefield now includes ports and pipelines. Because if your enemy can't beat you symmetrically, they can still make your normal life expensive and unstable. That may be the real doctrine hiding inside modern conflict. Not destroy everything, but make stability costlier than pressure. And if that sounds less cinematic than a stealth bomber montage, good. Cinematic is how people miss the engineering. The engineering story is that energy, shipping, and logistics are now so tightly coupled that conflict can travel through them like current through a wire.
Chapter 3: Infrastructure is the battlefield.
And then there's cyber, because apparently, modern war looked at physical conflict and said, you know what this needs? More surfaces. Reuters reports Greek ship owners and other companies have been scanning their computer systems for evidence of cyber attacks after advice from the National Cybersecurity Authority following incidents linked to the war. That is cyber spillover in plain English. The conflict is not politely staying inside a neat geographic box. It is leaking into commercial sectors that keep normal economies alive: shipping, banking, transport, telecom, health, energy. AP reports pro-Iranian hackers are targeting sites in the Middle East and starting to stretch into the United States, with risks reaching defense contractors, power stations, and water plants. Again, not just battlefield systems, civilian and commercial systems too. And then there's the detail that should make every "the cloud is magic" person slightly uncomfortable. AP reports Iranian drone strikes damaged 3 Amazon Web Services facilities in the Middle East, including 2 directly struck sites in the UAE and another damaged site in Bahrain. That is such a clean symbol of the era we're entering. The cloud is still physical. The internet still lives in buildings. Data still needs power, cooling, telecom, and geography. And geography does not care how sleek your dashboard looks. So now, add it all together. Drones in the sky, missiles stressing defense timing, ships avoiding choke points, energy hubs under threat, hackers probing commercial networks, data centers taking physical damage. That is not 5 separate stories. That is one systems story. The line between military target and civilizational support structure is getting thinner, blurrier, and nastier. And once that line thins out, the real strategic question becomes, who can keep their systems running longer? Not who has the coolest weapons demo. Who can keep power flowing, networks stable, logistics moving, and defenses supplied while cheap threats keep arriving in waves? That is a very different definition of winning. And honestly, it may be the one that matters most.
Chapter 4. Who can keep systems running?
So what does this war actually teach us? Best case, defense adapts faster than offense scales. Cheaper counter-drone tools show up, layered defenses get smarter, cyber hygiene improves, and critical infrastructure becomes harder to stress. Most likely, offense stays cheap and messy, defense stays expensive and layered, and everyone involved learns that resilience is now as important as raw firepower. Worst case, infrastructure becomes so easy to stress that winning starts to mean who can keep systems running longer while the other side burns cash, munitions, and public patience. And that last one is the nightmare. Because if that becomes the normal model of war, then civilian life gets dragged into the math whether civilians volunteered or not. You feel it in fuel prices, in shipping delays, in cloud outages, in cyber warnings, in market shocks, in the slow realization that your comfortable daily life depends on systems that are more exposed than you thought. That is the real takeaway. The Iran war is not just revealing better weapons, it is revealing a harsher cost structure. Cheap drones and missile complexity can impose huge defensive costs. The battlefield now includes energy hubs, ports, shipping lanes, data centers, and computer networks. And the contest is increasingly about systems endurance, not just battlefield attrition. So no, this is not mainly a politics story for this channel. It is an engineering story, a logistics story, a fragility story. A story about what happens when modern civilization discovers that keeping the machine running may be harder than building the machine in the first place. That's the lesson I'd watch. Not who yelled louder. Not which side has the better propaganda trailer. I want the lesson about cost, pressure, and endurance. Because that's the part that survives the headlines. Signal over hype. Subscribe to join the expedition.